going on, folks? Alright, so we're in the pickup truck. Sorry, you're going to have to hear the turbo spinning today. And I'm going to try to keep it down here. So let's talk about ignition timing. What is it we're attempting to achieve when we manipulate ignition timing? And the short answer to that is we are attempting to increase cylinder pressure to its peak without experiencing pre-ignition or knock. Knock is audible, and I'm not talking, like a connecting rod or anything like that. I'm talking about spark knock, as it's called, or pre-ignition. So pre-ignition basically means exactly what it says. Before the spark plug or the ignition fires, the fuel will self-ignite based on heat and cylinder pressure and how stable the fuel is. When we're looking at different fuels, octane, in layman's terms, how I typically tend to explain it, is its resistance to self-ignition, or how stable it is. The lower the octane, the less stable the fuel. The higher the octane, the more stable the fuel. So race fuel, everybody thinks is super scary. It's actually pretty stable stuff. It will take a lot of heat and a lot of pressure before it will ignite on its own. Whereas low octane fuel, it doesn't take a whole lot to get that stuff to combust on its own. If you've ever pumped 87 octane fuel into a vehicle in the middle of summer when it's hot, you've seen how fumy it is. Well, it's also very unstable. If you're looking at like race fuel, yeah, the fumes can be kind of overpowering. They're pretty rough. They smell bad, but they're not usually as light, as thin, I guess you would call it. They're not nearly as vaporous. The high octane fuels aren't. So they're a thicker consistency. So anyhow, when we're back to ignition here, we want to try to optimize the ignition timing to where the cylinder achieves its highest pressure at the point we're looking for on the piston, so that we can utilize as much of that power as possible. When we start manipulating cam timing, we can do the same kind of thing. That's why you change the camshaft in an engine and can make a lot of difference in the way that those engines run. And like with the new BBT bikes, you can manipulate how the cam sits in relation to the crank, so you can make a lot of difference in the way those engines run. You can bring power up, just make it flat across, whereas with normal cam, you can't really do that as much. If you do, it'll taper off on the top. If you're optimized for making it right off the bottom and coming across, then it's not going to have as much on top. If it has a bunch on top, it typically won't have as much on bottom. But when we start playing with ignition timing, we go in and we kind of tweak those numbers, we tweak that advance, and we optimize that ignition timing to make that cylinder pressure as high as possible where we want it, so we utilize as much of the stroke as possible to make power. And thus, voila, more power, more performance, more torque, more horsepower. One of the things I've noticed is, I grew up, I'm a redneck kid from the Midwest, so I live in Texas now, came down in the Army years ago. But either way, I grew up what you would call redneck style. We figured out how to do things. We knew the way that we were taught, and some of those things I've learned over the last 25, 30 years weren't necessarily the right way. One of those things is ignition timing. The standard advance had an old man that taught us, you advance it till it rattles, and then you back it off till it doesn't. And right where it doesn't rattle, you're good. That sounds good on paper, and in a basic sense it works. But I can tell you that one of the things I've learned from dyno tuning is you can sometimes pull timing and make power. You can overtime an engine. You can have too much timing in an engine, not hear pre-ignition, and not hear knock, and yet still have too much timing in it. Sometimes you can pull timing and make power, and I'm talking ignition, not just cam. You can go in and play with that ignition curve, and you'd be surprised how many times an engine is overtimed, because the standard answer on how to go about ignition timing is the same thing I was taught: is advance it till it rattles and back it off till it don't. And when it doesn't, you should be about there. Sounds good on paper, but in practice, not necessarily the case. So I'm not going to get into any more specifics than that today. But if you guys are wanting to learn about things like that, we do offer tuning classes, one-on-one and small classroom setting. So give us a call at the shop, 254-680-6881. Y'all take care.